The following video began as a review for the release of the major Canadian-Japanese animated series Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Unfortunately, during the process, the review fell apart. This footage now stands as a first-hand account of how the reviewing dream can become a ramble. Hello gang, lovely to see you again. It's been a while, as ever, and on that subject, the concept of time. Oh dear, I scared myself simply thinking about it. Oh no! There I go again. I suppose I'll have to ask Dufontaine for another pair of breeches. And speaking of that, the passage of time, that is, not my loyal servant Dufontaine, it's almost haunting how something that I once absorbed with my real eyes feels like a period piece now. The decision to so firmly ground Scott Pilgrim Takes Off in the era of its creation, old Netflix logo and all, is a terrifying portent of what being elderly is going to feel like, I imagine. Lord help me, one foot's in the grave already. Now, I warrant it's not going to be dramatically controversial to say that things have indeed changed ever so slightly since 2010, and even more has changed, of course, since young Scott Pilgrim waltzed into humanity's collective devil-may-care life in the early 2000s. He woke with the peal of the Millennium Bell, but it's been a quarter century since then, so the question has to be asked, what do we do with Scott Pilgrim now that Scott Pilgrim's taken off? That's right. I caught the clever wordplay in the title, so we're moving into this video with absolute confidence in my critical eye. So I was very excited when I first heard Scott Pilgrim was getting an animated series proper. I remember thinking back in 2010 when I first read the books, because the film seemed cool, that I kind of wished it was getting a cartoon instead of a feature film, because there's a lot of book to cover, and 90 minutes isn't a lot of time, realistically speaking. Give us 10 minutes for an introduction and 10 minutes for a climax and epilogue, and we're working with a solid 10 minutes per Evil X, and that's crazy. There's a lot of stuff to like in SPTO. Actually, hold on, I'm not going to call it that anymore. There's a lot to like in this adaptation, but it was not what I was expecting at all, and I think that's to be lauded. But it's also to be reacted to by going, wait, what? Huh? Because it turns out Scott Pilgrim Takes Off isn't actually an adaptation at all. It's a completely different thing. New story, new focus, new main character, new everything. And that's not what I expected. And I'm not even sure it's what I wanted, but I walked away from it liking it, so clearly it did something right. Let's do that thing I do where I try and figure out why that is. The voice acting can be a mixed bag, but that's really not as much of a complaint as it sounds like. Here, I'll make it sound more like one. The voice acting is a very mixed bag. Admittedly, I have affinity for the source material, which does, of course, bias this entire read and thus sinks this entire thing from the outset and completely ruins your newfound absolute confidence in my critical eye. But I think it's still very cool that despite the MCU inflating the asking prices for both Chris Evans and Brie Larson, they still came back to voice their respective characters, which I'm going to optimistically, naively attribute to their affinity for the source material, and not because they were paid substantially to do it. Actually, here's a pause for dramatic effect. Most everyone on the film's adaptation's cast did, including those who I didn't really think suited their roles for the film, he says, providing an unfortunate zag in the otherwise smooth fiction of these last few sentences. Julie's voice acting could certainly use a bit more emotional range, even if that's the character as written, but Mr. Evans' Lucas Lee is fantastic, and Kieran Culkin remains a pitch-perfect Wallace Wells. Are the bad performances enough to sink the good ones, or are the good ones just good enough to hand-wave the bad ones? Well. Look at me, a few months away from the channel, and I've become a BuzzFeed personality test. Some of them did meet me halfway. Ramona took an episode to grow on me, but I think Mary Elizabeth Winstead did a great job. I might even say she's a better Ramona here than she was in the film. I'll keep bashing my fists against the bars of my voice acting and film acting a hugely different disciplines jail cell until I'm just a torso all the same. I mean, Christ, just look at the state of the British voice acting industry. We have Stephen Fry and 3 people who used to play companions on Doctor Who. It's indisputably incredible to look at, which I think bears significant mention. The animation is stellar for the subject matter. Science Sari did a fantastic job capturing the energy of the series, even if it can feel somewhat overeager at times, but then again, it is Scott Pilgrim. It really does look like the Scott Pilgrim I wanted to see a decade ago when they released that Scott Pilgrim, I'm Dr. Steve fucking Brule. It really does look like the Scott Pilgrim that I wanted to see a decade ago when they released that Scott Pilgrim animated trailer for the film. However, that trailer did have Lisa Miller in it, which this version does not. She has once again been left on the cutting room floor. They're simply too afraid. She's a character that exclusively informs Scott's development and thus has little to no place in a story that trends more towards Ramona? Sure, but that's another strike, O'Malley. Oh, you're testing me. But no, the presentation works fantastically. The pop-ups are fun, rather unlike the ones you would contemporarily see on Zorn websites. The visual presentation is on point across the board. It's a delight to look at. It's a delight to listen to, too, for that matter. Anna Managuchi's back on the soundtrack, after all, and that was honestly one of the main draws to this SP variant. They did the music for the game of the movie of the graphic novel, so it's good to see the gang back for the remixed streaming series of the game of the movie of the graphic novel too. I can't say any specific song on said soundtrack particularly stood out for me, but hey, at least there's more gooch to listen to. I've been blasting Another Winter for the past month and a half at time of writing, so my playlist could use a little mix-up, and here I was sure they were all dead following the events of Fabula Nova Saga Capsule Silence 24. What a bizarre cut that is. Actually, before I jump in any deeper, I should say, given the way this show's set up, there's literally no way to talk about Scott Pilgrim Takes Off without spoiling the big episode 1 twist. If you're interested in seeing the new thrust of this series, and indeed haven't seen it already, it might be worth watching the first episode or two just to see what the situation is before we shove off from the port of blissful innocence into the black, storm-tossed waters of cruel, uncompromising knowledge. So, I'm well aware that there's really no point to the complaint that I would have liked to have seen an animated adaptation of the main story of Scott Pilgrim. That story has already been told twice in 2 different mediums, and I completely understand the desire to tell a different story this time around. However, I try not to be easy to please in order to live in a bubble of curdling, jaded apathy. I'd like for there to be an animated adaptation of the main story of Scott Pilgrim. Maybe I should simply hold out for Scott Pilgrim the Stage instead. I'll be the first to say that story was never particularly incredible, admittedly. It was mostly regarding how Scott really needed to mature, more than it did discuss his relationship with Ramona, which by and large served as an impetus for said maturity. Most of the books introduce a part of his immaturity as brought to the fore through his relationship with her, and it's most often resolved at the end of each book until we learn that old Scott has actually been lying to himself this whole time, and he's even worse of a guy than we thought he might have been to begin with, which is saying a lot given the way the series starts and all. The comics did dare to delve into Ramona's side of things from time to time, but this takes that concept and runs with it, which I think is a fairly major point in its favour, despite it also being one of my biggest issues with it. My word, what complex creatures we humans are. I can appreciate expounding upon and resolving that part of the narrative, since it was Scott's main impetus too, even if it comes at the cost of its retelling being completely subsumed by the new direction. One of the things that did always bother me on some level was how Ramona's character was, for the most part, a wall for Scott to bounce his immaturity off of, so this is a very welcome tonic for that aspect. She's a real character now. Hooray! Actually, a lot of the characters show off a more rounded personality here. Perhaps that's because they've by and large been divorced from the concept of being a series of evil exes to be overcome, or perhaps I'm just a simple fool easily tricked by still images when they're given motion and audio, who can say? Even though I just said all of that, give me a moment, because here comes another one of my famous curveballs. I find Takes Off is rather intensely less subtextual than the original, which is saying a lot for a series that makes liberal use of non-diegetic video game-style pop-ups explaining what's going on. According to an interview with O'Malley, though, that's by design. I think most people who've read the book or seen the film know the opening line, Scott Pilgrim is dating a high schooler, and for good reason. It's the tone setter. It tells us Lil Pilgrim's doing a bad thing out of the gate, and sets our expectations for this funky character and his mandatory trip through character development boot camp. This time around, though, they threw in some lines about how it was clearly wrong that this 23-year-old guy was dating a 17-year-old high schooler. They spell it out for us just in case we missed it. Or rather, to be sure, we couldn't, by having the characters comment about how that's a bad thing for someone to do, just in case anyone out there thinks for a moment that the series is somehow endorsing that kind of thing, which is more than a little depressing. It reminds me conceptually of that Garfield without Garfield idea, and similarly, despite how much of a schmuck he is, it's almost sad to see how Scott's presumed death makes everyone's lives better but Ramona's. I'm sure I'm not projecting there, and of course, spoiler warning, that's quite literally the point of the show, and it does subsequently resolve nicely enough, but it does stick out to me that at some point in the creative process, I'll hazard a guess it was near the start, since I'm so clever and all, the question was asked, what if we did Scott Pilgrim without Scott Pilgrim? As I said before, the name's double meaning isn't lost on me. Still, even mentioning Scott feels a bit apocryphal given the content matter, right? I feel like a more indicative name would be something like Ramona Flowers dies at the start, since she, dies ahead. That's a gem. Nobody steal that one. Hold on, I'm calling Mr. O'Malley now. So it's got a few issues with pacing, although I concede that this, as with literally every other aspect of the critiquing process, is subjective. But speaking generally, I think we can all mostly agree that there's a point of no return, after which something becomes simply too fast, after which all narrative structure breaks down, like my trust in the British rail service, after my train home was cancelled after a night flight back to the UK. Some people call this the Sonic the Hedgehog of narrative delivery, but I don't know who those people are. For example, I think back very fondly on my experience of watching Rise of Skywalker in the theatre, not because I in any way enjoyed the film, but rather from the memory of having one of the people I saw it with, who were themselves a notorious Star Wars fan, concede that the film was a complete mess before we engaged in a spirited discussion of just how badly the film was paced. And also that part where the gang all rode Shetland ponies on the outer hull of a Star Destroyer too. God, not to beat a dead horse, but what a genuinely horrendous film. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Whilst the opening ramp-up felt like it was flying by, I found the latter half had much more consistent plotting. Perhaps the discrepancy is more owed to me being blindsided by the narrative twist, or maybe 8 episodes is a pretty meager amount of time to tell a relatively complicated story like this. Either way, the first 3 episodes really felt like they were rushing through plot beats quick. It is funny, though. A decent amount of the comedy came from Miss Winstead's performance as Ramona and Mr. Culkin's Wallace, of course, but young Neil's deadpan idiocy actually worked on me more times than it didn't. I do wish they didn't always call out the joke, though, but it is what it is. You miss every dunk you don't slam. It was nice to see Simon Pegg and Nick Frost showing up in a sort of pseudo-legacy Edgar Wright nod on that subject. That's always fun. And indeed, Edgar Wright himself, played by Weird Al Yankovic for some reason. Though it was odd to see a British security in Toronto, but there we are. Really, the whole thing is riding a knife edge of metatextuality that somewhat prevented me from getting overly invested in it. And this is coming from a fan of this series, but with all the references to the original media, not without reason, of course, but still, this is less a show about Scott Pilgrim's precious little life, and more a show about Scott Pilgrim's precious little legacy. It's a series made about a series. It's, dare I say it, postmodern. Does it have its own merits? Absolutely. I don't mean to say that to denigrate a show I genuinely enjoyed watching. It was funny. I arguably like the characters here more than I've done in any of the previous iterations of this story. It looks great. The music's pleasant. Overall, it's a high-quality show, but I feel like it's a show for people who already know the series. And people who already know the series probably wanted to see an animated adaptation of it, rather than a story about the story, but we're getting rather metatextual here ourselves, so perhaps I'd best err on the side of caution. After all, somewhere out there down some subspace highway, there's probably a 24-episode series that's 3 episodes per book, and it's the perfect retelling of Scott Pilgrim that I imagined when I heard Scott Pilgrim was getting a run on Netflix, and the me of that universe is probably writing a script about how Scott Pilgrim's narrative hits different in 2024 because the world's moved on, and what he'd really like to see is an exploration of the deuteragonist's perspective. So I suppose regardless of what world I'm in, I'm simply impossible to please. No true Scott man, you might say. Was this whole script in service of that joke? Absolutely.